Natasha Denona I Need a Nude Palette. It is here. Let's unbox it, go over all the details. I got swatches, I got comparisons. We're doing looks. I know I look super glam right now, but don't worry, I provided you with a lot of natural look options and also how to convert those looks into nighttime looks. So super versatile. We're gonna go over my very strict criteria for eyeshadow palettes. Is it practical? Does it perform well? And is it still creative enough that it inspires me to make new looks? Before we open this up, let me give you a little bit of background info of what kind of lens I have going in reviewing this palette. I'm not a huge eyeshadow collector person, especially high end. On the everyday basis, I'm usually using some sort of ColourPop palette. This is my first ever full-size Natasha Denona palette. I do have some of her mini palette, but I wanted to hold out until I found a color story that I really love because a lot of the neutrals were definitely warm leaning. And then this little sucker came out and of course I had to get it. If you have fair skin, maybe you just like more cool neutrals, you might be really interested in this one as well, so let's open it up. Once you take it out of the box, it has this really pretty neutral packaging with sort of, I guess, like a mod mid-century type of just shape there, and then it looks like on the back that you can pop these shadows off. You can pop these eyeshadows out, not off. And then this is like a frosted matte finish, and then the front is like a smooth plastic, has pretty thick plastic overlay actually. And then you open it up and you get your shadows in here along with the mirror. So let's actually pull this off. Should be satisfying. Yes, that is nice. So really nice, big, shiny, high quality mirror, I must say. Not every palette has a good one. That one is really nice looking. So here is a first look at the eyeshadow. You will probably be seeing some close-ups at this point. You have a really nice mix of mattes and shimmer shades. There's two pink shades and then the rest of them are these very sort of neutral cool tones. Also a light pink sparkle. So there's a variety of metallic finishes and then you just have the mattes, of course. I went ahead and swatched these in terms of the rows. So I started off with the first row, which has the shade Stone, Whisper, Ella, Vague, and then Travertine. These are very much some taupey nudes, except for that Vague shade, which is a little bit more rosy. They all swatch very nicely. I also made sure to do the swatches in both natural light, and then I turned on one of my box lights so you get a little taste of both. And then the second row we have here is Delilah, Silhouette, which is that deep brown, Muse, which is the most like shimmery foil shade of the palette, Fair, and then Fildry. And then that last bottom row, which has this really interesting peach shade, kind of stands out the most in the palette, which is Wit, Sheen, Tender, Mesh, and then Mia. So when I sit back and look at the colors in this palette, everything seems to make sense. The one thing that might stand out to me is this peach shade here. Because everything else is so cool neutral, and that's like a very warm peach shade, it's a little bit confusing. I did end up using that in one of the looks and I talk a lot more about it later and what it brings to the palette and what it possibly takes away from it, so stay tuned for that. Those are the swatches. Now into comparisons of other palettes. The first thing that I thought of was the ColourPop Stone Cold Fox palette and also the ColourPop That's Taupe palette, which also happen to be two of my most used palettes, which makes sense why I was really drawn to this one. So I did try to find some comparison swatches, but let's just open up the Stone Cold Fox palette by ColourPop. This one is a lot bigger to begin with. It also has this row of warm tones and it has a lot more purple tones in it. Overall, I do feel like they have a similar vibe. There's definitely a lot of similarities in the matte in this ColourPop palette compared to the Natasha Denona one. In this palette, you also get some of the Super Shock shades, which are really creamy. They have that high impact glossy look like some of these shimmers in the I Need a Nude palette as well. This is similar but also very different in my mind because you have those grays, you have the warm tones as well in the purple tones. It covers a lot more than the I Need a Nude palette, which is either a pro or a con depending on how you like to use eyeshadow. I personally like something a little bit more pared down. This is great if I just need a color, but I am gravitating towards the size of this one a little bit more. So comparing it to the smaller ColourPop palette, which is called That's Taupe. This is such a great little palette if you didn't want the full Stone Cold Fox one that still has a very similar vibe to the Natasha Denona one. You don't use a ton of cool neutrals, but you still wanted a little something. This is a really nice in-between I really like ColourPop shadows. You also get these shimmer shades, especially this one is super high impact and really pretty. The ColourPop Super Shock shades are a lot creamier than these Natasha Denona shimmers, but they still apply really beautifully. We'll talk more about these comparisons and if it's worth even buying this one in the end. Without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into the 3 looks I created for you so we can examine the practicality and usability of this palette on the everyday basis. So let's go. Alright, let's get into some looks and get our grimy little hands all over this new palette. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off with some very natural, super practical looks that you can wear on the everyday basis. So let's start with my first version of a very natural everyday look. This look was my first instinct of pairing the colors together as something that I would wear on the everyday basis. So hopefully you find it very practical as well. So I have absolutely nothing on my eyelids. I don't want to do a primer. I just want to show you what they look like on their own, on my bare eyelids. They are a little bit oily, but that's just how they are. So we'll see how that works. First, to sort of just prep the eye, I am going to go in with this shade Fair, which is a little bit darker than my natural skin tone, just by a little bit. I'm just gonna even out and mattify it down a little bit of oiliness that we have going on. If you're very fair like me, it's funny the name of this shade is Fair. It is like, it acts as a transition shade. It looks like it's lighter in the pan, but I feel like on the lid, it does have some more depth to it. If you want it to be super simple, you could totally just skip this step. Next is this shade called Mesh, which is the lightest taupe in the palette. Taking this on a bit of a smaller brush, I'm just going to start to work this in my crease. These are really beautiful matte formulas. As I'm blending it out, there's like no patchiness. I'm gonna dip back in and just get a little bit more. I always like to build upon a color versus just putting too much on at once. Before I move on, I'm taking that same color I just used called Mesh, and I'm going to run that on my lower lash line. This next step is also optional. I'm just gonna use it to deepen up the crease just a little bit using this shade Stone, which is the second darkest taupe shade that we have in the palette, on a smaller, more detailed brush. And I'm just going to focus this on the outer V of both of my eyes and then slightly bring that in. I don't want it to be too dramatic, so I'm sort of just keeping it in that area. Going back in with that same brush into the same shade called Stone, and then I'm just going to focus that on the outer corner of my lower lid. And then if you want to blend even more, going back into that first lightest shade, which was Fair, on a fluffy brush. Since this is really close to my skin tone, but not quite, it's a really good just shade to use to blend out any of the edges to create a very diffused effect. So bam, that's about it I would do for the crease, and then moving on to the lid shade. When I first got this palette, the 2 shades I was like, which one should I try first, are the lighter sparkly shades. The pink one we have here is Mia, and then we have this other one called Sheen, which is a little bit more of a neutral. Depending if you like pink or more of a neutral shade, you could use either one. I'm gonna go into the pink shade called Mia, which is my personal pick for this, something I would wear on the everyday. But when I first played with this palette, I did mix both of the shades. I did this one on the inner corner and then the more sort of neutral one on the outer corner. As you can tell, it's a quite sparkly shade, but I do still find it very wearable. If you don't wear a liner, you could stop here, add a little bit of mascara, and it's a super simple everyday look that still has a little bit of just like, I love the intensity of the sparkle, just adds a little something while still being very neutral and simple. But I am going to do a shadow liner. That's what I do on the everyday basis, so I thought it would be fitting. Using the one deep shade in here, which is called Silhouette, which is I would say it's an espresso brown. It doesn't have a lot of warmth to it, but make sure to tap off that excess. And then what I do is just stamp that on the outer corner. I don't bring it in too far. So I just stamp, 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 and then drag it out just using the tip of the brush. I'm not getting really any fallout so far, maybe a little bit of like a sparkle over here, but making sure to tap that dark shade so we don't get any, but it didn't sort of flake up the glitter shade or anything. Taking a little bit of a sharp brush, it just has nothing on it, just to sharpen up the wing. I love the tones of this look. I love the pink shimmer in this look. My one critique of this palette though, which is what I would want to finish this look off with, that this palette does not have, which I feel like a lot of palettes don't have, and I always have to go to a different one to end up finding it, but a light enough Either matte or slightly shimmery shade, I wouldn't mind. A light enough shade to actually highlight in my inner corner and my brow bone. The lightest shade that we have is the Pink Sparkle, which is just too sparkly to sort of do that. And then we have the fair shade, which isn't actually a highlight shade for me. If you're darker, this might fill that gap for you, but for me, if you're as fair as me, it's just not gonna work as a highlight. You could throw in literally a matte white and I would be happy with that, a little bit of an off-white. I just feel like that's something I wish I really had in here to finish this off with. So now I'm just gonna throw on a little bit of mascara. This is the Maybelline Sky High Mascara. I'm gonna use the brown one because it really goes with the tones of this palette. And voila, here is our first look. I would wear this anywhere, honestly. This is a beautiful everyday look in my opinion. I feel like these tones are extremely flattering for my skin tone. Just sort of brings out my natural coloring, and because they are so flattering, it looks even more natural, unlike some warm tones that really can just stand out on my skin because they're not as cohesive looking. As you continue to watch this video, I would love to know in the comments below which one of the looks ends up being your favorite and one you would wear the most. Before we take this off into our next natural look, I actually want to show you how I would build upon this one. So if you wanted to do sort of a day to night look, this is how I would do it. So dipping back into the palette, the first thing I would start doing is definitely deepening up the outer corner. So going into this shade called Tender, which is sort of that mid-tone taupey brown that we used earlier. Again, on a smaller brush in circular motions, I'm going to be building this up mostly on that outer corner again for a bit of a smoky effect. Now doing the same over here. I will say these are really nicely pigmented and blendable shades. They're nothing like spectacular. Like, I feel like it's not gonna blow your mind. Sometimes I feel like they're hyped up to be like that. They're really nice eyeshadows, but they're not gonna change your life, I don't think. You're just gonna be like, okay, that's nice. Now you can tell we're getting a little bit more drama there, and then to match that, I'm gonna do the same on the bottom lash line. Taking a little bit of a smaller, dense brush, same shade called Tender. And then to further dramatize this look, I'm actually gonna go into a shimmer shade. I'm going to take this deep sparkly brown here, which is called Tilbury. I think that's how you say that, which is very, very pigmented and soft formula. And I'm just gonna tap this on the outer corner. Not gonna worry too much about blending it yet. And then taking that brush we used with the matte shade, I'm going to soften that into the rest of the shades. I was sort of wondering if these shimmers, when you blend them with a brush, if they're gonna blend away sort of a lot of their particles or prettiness, you know, but I feel like that did hold up pretty well. You know, some shimmers use a brush and they kind of just like disappear. I feel like these are holding up pretty good. So here's our slightly amped up version of that everyday look. It was really easy to build upon this to make it a little bit more dramatic. You could also go back in with that matte brown, redefine the liner, but I like this because it still is relatively natural, super pretty, and it just has this really nice glow to it now that we added an additional shimmer on the outer corner. Back to our bare canvas, this is going to be natural look number 2. This is going to take a slightly warmer, pinker route of this palette because we do have these more peachy, rosy shades. That was kind of my second initial thought when looking at this. I was like, okay, really pretty, nice, cool neutral look that you could do. Then you could also easily go that more pink route with the help of those shades. I'm gonna start again with that fair shade, which was that lightest matte skin tone shade, just to get a base going. Next, just using that same brush, I'm gonna go into this shade, which is called Wit. Not really showing up on camera, but it is a bit peachier in person. It's almost one of those colors, like it stands out a lot in this palette because it doesn't necessarily look like it belongs, which we will talk about a little bit later. I'm just blending that into my crease using that same fluffy brush. So already I feel like this look is a lot different just with that tone, going in with that same shade, small brush. Same deal, smoking this on the lower lash line. Next up, smaller brush, taking this more muted rose, which I feel like is a lot more fitting. This one is called Vague. And I'm gonna stamp this into the outer corner and then blend that into the peach that we laid down. Must say that peach wasn't the most pigmented. I did have to sort of build that up quite a lot. I'm also gonna bring that one on the lower lash line. I'm making this one a bit more smoky than our first look, which was the ultra natural one. Next for the lid shade, I'm going to use Sheen, which is more of that neutral metallic. This shade is also one of the shades in the palette that is leaning a little bit more like neutral It definitely is just like a champagne type of vibe. This one compared to the pink one does have some smaller sparkle in it. As you can tell, it's not giving me that same like wow effect, which does make it a little bit more natural. Next, taking the deep espresso brown called Silhouette. I'm gonna do the same thing that we did on that first look. A little repetitive, I know, but that shade is the only deep matte option, which I don't mind because I really only use it for things like this. Here's our second natural look using the I Need a Nude palette, which is the peachier, warmer version of the first look that we did. Now to amp this one up, since there's not really any deeper, peachier shades to build up the outer corner, I would opt for adding more shimmer on to make it dramatic. So to do that, I'm going to use this center sort of star of the show shade, which is called Muse, which is one of those like wet look, very foiled eyeshadows. Gorgeous. I'm going to tap this on the center of the lid, still leaving that lighter shade on the inner corner though. And then I would go back in with the deep espresso shade called Silhouette on that small brush. Very lightly smoke out that wing. That sort of foiled shade does give me a little bit of fallout. I got like a big chunk of it under my eye. Okay, it did not come off very easily, so I'm gonna have to redo my concealer on that. Taking whatever's left over on that lower lash line. Same clean brush, cleaning up the outer edges. So here is the night version, slightly glammed up version of our second natural look. Just smoked it out a little bit more, added a little bit more dimension and pop to the center of the lid. I find it really interesting that I still was able to come up with a look that is more warm leaning using that palette, just because they included that shade Wit. It's super peachy, so it really warms up anything that you put it with. So I'm redoing my concealer for the glam look. I'm going to try these shadows with a base to see how they compare, if they're gonna stick a little bit better. Just wanted to do bare lids at first for the ultimate just performance test. This is the About Face eyelid primer, by the way. So I'm just going to prime these suckers, prime these peepers. All right, now let's blend out that concealer. Before we move on to the more glam night out type of just like full in on this palette look with the darker shades, I'm going to bake my concealer. That way if we get any fallout, it's not gonna stick directly to my face. All right, powder's baking. I don't actually know the look that I'm gonna do, so that will be the test for sort of, is this gonna inspire me in a good direction? Any darker look, you always wanna start off with the base still to get a nice transition going. Going back into the shade Mesh, which is the light taupe. Seems to be one of the most versatile shades in this palette so far. Honestly has a perfect undertone. It's not too cool. It still has a nice neutrality to it. Do you feel like they're sticking or blending a little bit more pigmented with that base going? Take that same brush and go into the fair light shade, which is that lightest shade in the palette, and then just go around that shade to blend it in. I am getting a little bit of patchiness on this eye. Might have been that primer, or it just might be, I mean, it's gotta be the primer because we tried it on a bare lid and it didn't do that. All right, now we gotta continue building this sucker up. So we're going into the next taupe shade, which is called Stone. Sort of just a step up from that shade we used. So instead of focusing this on the outer corners like we did with the more natural look, this is kind of just becoming a transition as well. Just want to build upon the depth that we have. Yeah, it is weird. I'm noticing on this eye too, there's sort of a line of where the shadow's sticking to and where it's not. I'm guessing it's that primer it's really sticking to. Maybe I just didn't blend it the best up there. Next, taking Tender, which is the third darkest taupe. Still just working in the mattes here. Taking a more flat brush, I'm going to start packing this into the outer corner. Also starting to build a little bit of a wing. I'm not going to do anything on the lower lash line yet. I'm just going to work on blending these. Patchiness is becoming super evident now. I don't think I'm gonna blame the shadows. I think it was just the primer. Next, we're gonna be really careful but taking the deep espresso brown called Silhouette on a flat brush. I'm gonna start stamping out more defined wing shape. I'm sort of doing a wing here, like if I were to make a wing liner. We are gonna blend it out though. It's gonna blend in with our shimmers. Just want that base of the direction that we're going. So I swatched some of the sparkly browns just to see which ones we're gonna use. A lot of these are pretty similar. Like I feel like they don't have a lot of range in terms of the depth of them. Next with this shimmer shade called Tilbury, which is the deepest shimmer shade in the palette, on my fingers. I'm going to basically stamp that over the outer corner work that we just did. Do have some fallout here, so good thing we have that powder base. So now hopefully you can see why I put that down. It's so I sort of know what shape to go in. Shade is really pretty, almost has this gunmetal-esque-ness to it. That didn't make sense. It's sort of like a gunmetal shade. It's really pretty. So this shade is a little bit confusing to me because it looks like it would be pretty dark. It doesn't have, I guess it's one of more of these softer metallics. It doesn't have a ton of actual chunky glitter in it. It's one of the smoothest metallics that we have here. I guess it's more of a shimmer, not a metallic. So I'm gonna take this one called Ella, which has a little bit more chunkiness to it. On my finger, actually this one, yeah, a little chunkier than that shade, but still not full chunk. Next, taking that fluffy brush, I'm going to go around the edges. I don't want to go over the actual shades too much because I want to keep the strength of the metallic, just to blend everything. Next, taking this super pretty shade, which is called Delilah. This one's really interesting. It has a taupe base and it's really similar to the shade Mia, like the same formula, where it has a pretty strong like silvery type of reflect to it. And I'm gonna pop this on the inner portion. And then I'm gonna take the Mia shade, which was that pink one we used in the first look. Still using my fingers for these. I'm gonna pop this on the very inner corner. Since we have a lot of the taupes going on the top portion of the eye, I'm actually gonna go in with that rosy shade. I didn't mean to like actually touch that. And basically start smoking that for our lower lash line and connecting the shape that we have with the wing. Actually bringing that almost to the inner corner of my eye, but not quite. Can be the base for the darker shades. Just taking the same brush, I'm gonna go into that deep espresso brown. First by stamping it on the outer corner and then blending it out. Dipping back into the deep espresso brown, I'm just gonna reinforce the wing right on the outer corner because I don't think I'm gonna do additional eyeliner. I just want this to be the shape that we have. But you still have the shimmer that we blended over that. To sort of tie in the lower lash line, I am gonna take a little bit of the vague rose shade on a fluffy brush. Very lightly gonna feather that on the inner corner. Just gonna add that sort of hint of pinky warmth, but overall the vibe of the look is still very cool toned. See, all I need now is like a brighter inner corner shade that I could do there and the brow bone. Really wish this palette had that. I have used every single shade in this palette for all three of these looks. Do have quite a lot of fallout going on because I layered so many shimmers, not a crazy amount though, which is a little bit surprising. And I'm gonna go back into my powder and do the trick I've been doing this whole time, just to clean up the wing shape, make things look a little bit sharper. This is really pretty. I'm not really feeling like I need to add any more to it. It's sort of my perfect level of drama right now. So I'm gonna go in and just brush off my powder bake. All right, I just did some of the Kiss Sister Nature lashes in Sage to just fully glamify this look. Now let's do a little bit of a lip. I'm gonna use the Urban Decay Vice Bond lipstick. This one's the shade OG Back Talk, which is really pretty purpley nude. I'm gonna mix in a little bit of the Give 'em Back Talk shade, which is more of this like purple brown. Okay, so this is the look without the inner corner brightness, but I want to add this just to show you what it's gonna do for the look, because I just really wish this palette had something light enough. I really just need something in the inner corner and the brow bone. I'm adding a little bit of this Flower Beauty Bare Pout, which is a super nude color. Just feel like I wanted a little bit more lightness on the lips with the super dramatic eye. So here's our final glam night out type of vibe look. And since that's the last of our looks, we're gonna talk about the performance. Did it meet all my criteria? Is it worth it? All the good stuff you need to know. So let's do it. So the burning question y'all wanna know, is this going to be worth it for you? Let's line it up against my criteria, my very strict eyeshadow criteria, and see how it does. First off was the practicality. If I'm spending some good moolah on a palette, I want to be able to use it every day and not just have it sit in my drawer, because that doesn't really make sense. That's one of the reasons why I was called to this palette, is because the color story is very similar to things that I use on the everyday basis. So I feel like that's a question you should ask yourself is this similar to the colors that you wear? If it is, it might be a really good purchase if you want something that's sort of pared down. I feel like this is the perfect size of a palette compared to the ColourPop one I have that's a bit bigger. It can be confusing. I feel like you have everything you need, except my one critique was that it doesn't have a light highlight shade for me personally. If you're darker than me, it's probably not going to be an issue, but if you are as fair as me, I feel like this palette very fair skin friendly, except for the part where it doesn't have that light enough shade. I was able to create those two very natural looks, but that's not all you can do with this. There's a lot more variation that you could create. For example, I did not use this Whisper shade in a natural look, but it's a really natural texture compared to everything else we have in this palette that's a little bit more glittery. It's more smooth looking, it's very neutral. You could totally do looks and use really like only 2 to 3 of these shades and you have a full look going, which I really appreciate about it. Next, let's talk about the performance of this palette. Does it wear well? Did it blend well? All the good stuff. First off, in terms of the pigmentation, they're really beautifully pigmented. I feel like I don't want an eyeshadow that's too pigmented. I also don't want one that's too sheer, and I feel like these sit in the middle of the dark shades are pigmented enough, the shimmers are pigmented, although I do feel like within the shimmers, some of them are a little bit less pigmented, the ones with a little bit less glitter, but I do like the variation in sort of the formulation, But anyway, I really didn't have a lot of issues with blending them out. They're really nice. Like I said, they're not like mind-blowing formulas. I did get a little bit of patchiness, but I'm almost completely sure that it was from the base that I put on and not the actual shadows themselves, because when I was blending them on my bare lids, I didn't really have that issue, so I will have to continue to play around with that. I do have oily lids, so I also did a look with this yesterday. I wore it all day with nothing on my eyelids to see if they stand up or wear longer than my normal eyeshadows, and there was really no difference. It sort of transferred and got oily just like my other eyeshadows do, because I just got oily lids, so I do need to wear a base for my eyeshadow. So if you're like maybe imagining these as being super long wearing, they're not like anything special. So my other question with this palette is it gonna inspire me to create new looks? And I will say that it did pass that test. I'm really excited to explore what other like combinations I could come up with within this palette. With this look, I kind of put almost all of the shimmers on, but I feel like you can refine them even more. There's a lot of different combinations that you can do, but I still enjoy how it has the building blocks of a palette. I will say in terms of the building blocks, which I would say are the matte shades, this fair shade, it was an okay transition. If they replaced that with just something that was lighter, I would be very happy. I'm also not really sure about this shade called Wit. I'm almost 50-50 on it because it's so warm. It almost doesn't seem like it has a place in this palette. Like if you look at it without that, it just makes a lot more sense. But I'm also not totally against it because it's so warm. You can transform any of these into a more warm look, which is quite interesting if you wanted something very versatile. But I'm also like, it's a cool neutral palette. It's not a warm palette, so probably not going to be a shade that I reach for a ton. Maybe if I wanted something peachy, but I really just love the tones of these cool neutrals. That's something that's really standing out to me about this. Just the tones of these, they're very unique. I haven't tried anything. I would say they're perfect on my skin tone. Like if I were to make a palette, they would be this tone. Because the ColourPop one that I have is similar, but those lean, they're either a little bit too cool, or on the other side, they do have some like warm shades. There's not really anything like these mattes in those palettes. There's some very similar ones. They're definitely on the cooler side, but they're not too cool, but they're also not leaning warm besides that one peach. Now, if I were to critique the shimmers in this palette, I do feel like a lot of these taupey shimmers are quite similar in the depth. As I was doing this look, you kind of saw that they were pretty similar. So this one looks like it would be darker, but it's not a lot darker than these other ones that we have. So I would almost maybe make this almost as deep as that espresso shade if you wanted something to be like super dramatic but you still wanted a shimmer. That's how I would possibly tweak this. So this was my first experience with a full Natasha Denona palette, and I am impressed, but I want to forewarn you that it's not anything mind-blowing. Again, the shimmers are really pretty. I think they are a unique aspect of this palette, is the shimmers. I think the mattes are really unique as well because they're just such a great formula and the tones are perfection. So if you are a cool neutral lover, I think you will get a lot of use out of this palette. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I rarely ever buy eyeshadow palettes, especially high-end palettes, because I already have ones that I like and I use. But this one just really, I mean, it's neutral. It's nothing like extraordinary, but that's why I like it so much, is because it is super practical. It performed really well. I think it lived up to the price, how I would expect it to perform. Didn't have a ton of issues. and it does still inspire some creativity. Not too boring, but still very usable, so it's that perfect in between. All in all, I definitely give this palette a thumbs up. I will be sure to do some looks with it in the future. Let me know in the comments below which look was your favorite. Let me know. Can't wait to hear which one you enjoyed the best. Don't forget to give this video a like if you did enjoy it, found it helpful. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.